Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I am Ronica Hutchison, the Managing Symposium Editor for the Journal of Law Reform here at Michigan Law. And today we are really delighted to have a bunch of incredible speakers here to discuss the surveillance of communities of color and ending that targeted surveillance. So really excited to hear everyone's remarks on the topic. To moderate our panel today, we have Professor Daniel Fryer. Professor Fryer is new to Michigan law, and he joins us to discuss criminal law, philosophy of law, civil rights, and he's also really interested in social movements outside of the academy. So this is a great topic for him to have here with us moderating. So really appreciate your involvement. And with that, I'll hand it off to Professor Fryer.
Thank you, Ronica, and thank you everyone for joining us during this lunch hour. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here. So I'm just going to start off with some brief introductions to let everyone know who's in front of them on the screen, and then we're going to get started. Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone in the bottom of the screen, there should be a comment or Q&A feature. So feel free to ask questions throughout the time. There's a designated time at the end of the session in which we would take questions, but you don't have to wait until I affirmatively say like now is the time to ask questions. Just ask it throughout, and then we'll combine them, put some together, and start asking those to the panelists throughout the session. So let's just get started with who we have here. So first up, we have Dr. Chris Gilliard, who is a writer, professor, and speaker. His scholarship concentrates on digital privacy, an intersection of race, class, and technology. Chris is an advocate for critical and equity-focused approaches to tech and education, and his work has been featured in Chronicle of Higher Education, Fast Company, Vice, and as well as other formats that are too extensive to name here. We also have here Shakir Rahman, who's a lawyer and community organizer with Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. Previously, Shakir was an impact litigation attorney at the Bronx Defenders, where he worked on systematic lawsuits against police and courts. Shakir has written about policing in prisons in the Harvard Law Review, the New York Times, Al Jazeera, Dissent, and other venues. He's currently a race and technology practitioner fellow at Stanford University Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. Third up, we have Eric Williams, who is a managing attorney in the Detroit Justice Center's economic equity practice. He's also a lead attorney of the ACLU of Michigan's committee opposing Project Greenlight in Detroit, which I'm sure we'll hear a lot about today. And finally, we have Harvey G, who is an attorney for the San Jose City's Attorney's Office and contributing author to the Michigan Journal of Law Reform Symposium, Volume 55, Issue 4. His research focuses on issues of technology and police surveillance, Asian American representation, and criminal procedure. Now, these are just brief introductions just to give everyone a sense of who's in front of them. But the speakers are going to say more about what they do and who they are throughout the course of this hour. But I just want to give you a quick and dirty summary of like who we have here in front of you. So we'll just start off with a broad question, which gets to the heart of the reason that we are here in the first place. And the question is simply, how does police surveillance technology disproportionately impact communities of color, right? This is a big issue, and it became a more common issue that has received attention in more recent years. So I want to just try to put the problem on the table and give each speaker to say what the problem is. And in addition to stating what the problem is, could you just speak about how your work examines or challenge that problems? And this is broad, but Chris, I'll ask you to start us off.
Yeah, and thanks for having me. I'm going to be super brief because I'm most interested in what everyone else has to say. But I just want to say, I mean, I think it's important to, when I think about this, and I encourage other people to think about that, all surveillance tech either is or eventually becomes police tech and police surveillance. And so as somebody who studies surveillance, one of the kind of maxims about it is that the harms come first and most egregiously to marginalized populations. And so we see that in a lot of different areas. I'll speak to, I'm sure, as the panel goes on. But how my work mostly speaks to that is, I mean, first and foremost, I teach at a community college, and so I talk about this stuff with my students, testify before Congress about this, but also talk about the ways that sort of consumer tech, like Ring doorbells, Amazon Alexas, things like that, eventually again become things that are leveraged. Geofence warrants from Google become things that are leveraged against people when they're used by law enforcement. Yeah, that's it.
Shakir?
Yeah, thanks. So as Daniel mentioned, I'm with Stop by Peace Spying Coalition. We're a community group based in Skid Row neighborhood of Los Angeles, which is the reason I want to start with that is to just highlight Skid Row as a place that new policing technologies have long been tested. Skid Row has some of the highest concentration of policing anywhere in the country, likely in the world. And Stop by Peace Spying was basically formed to take on a particular or a kind of set of national security surveillance programs that were rolled out by the federal government, but were transforming local policing. And so these kinds of programs are kind of window into this question of surveillance's disproportionate impact on communities of color, because these programs, even though they were kind of presented in the lens of national security and a part of the war on terror, what they did was they invested more resources and technologies in local police, who then used it to target the same Black, brown, and poor communities that they've always targeted. And so that dynamic that we see, and especially the impact of these programs, like one is the Federal Suspicious Activity Reporting Program, a kind of data-driven police surveillance, national security surveillance program, basically using kind of demonization of Muslim communities and migrant communities to invest more resources and power in policing. And so in our work, it's often these ideologies, these political dynamics, the kind of narratives and justifications that are used to justify surveillance that we're confronting and organizing against. And most recently, over the last 5 or so years, we've been really focused on what we call data-driven policing, and as part of that, predictive policing systems, which are use of algorithms for the police to determine, or both to determine who they're going to target or places they're going to target, as well as to justify the decisions that they're already making about where they're policing and how. And when you look at the data on that, it bears out absolutely that the same communities that have always been targeted, that's what this data is helping them target now. So one of these programs had basically generated these lists of who police would call chronic offenders based on using kind of Palantir, which is a data mining platform, to determine targets of who they're going to go after. These chronic offenders that they were targeting, around half of them were Black in a city that's less than 10% Black. And that, even though they're labeling people chronic offenders, their own kind of audit showed that a lot of the people put on these lists had no prior arrests, no prior police contact. They were just being put on these lists because, police were using these data systems to do that. As well as kind of targeting locations, designating specific areas as high crime areas or drivers of crime, kind of predetermining them for crime. And that would include places like, parks, churches, schools. One was Nipsey Hussle's Marathon clothing store in the Crenshaw district, the entire Crenshaw Mall, which in Los Angeles is a kind of historically and presently, kind of Black gathering space and mall. And what would happen in these areas was when you tell police to go into a place and kind of prime them, telling them it's going to be a hotspot for crime or predetermined for crime, they're going to go in there primed to be targeting people and using violent force. And so in a 6-month period, our research uncovered that police killed 6 people in these predictive policing zones. All of them were Black or Latino, 4 were teenagers, 4 of them were shot in the back. And I just want to end with one kind of a quote that we spoke recently with the grandmother of one of the young men who was killed. His name was Keith Bursey, and he was approached at one of these predictive policing target zones because police saw him driving or in a car and wearing a White Sox hat, and police had some, intelligence or surveillance information that that hat was associated with a certain kind of gang, and so they pulled him over, and in that stop, they shot and killed him. And when we were speaking with his grandmother about some of these data systems and kind of asking her about, its data and the objectivity of data, she really kind of articulated the problem with that thinking in a really clear way that I want to quote. She said, the computer doesn't just, and this is the quote, the computer doesn't just go out and pick up data. It's police that put the data into the computer. The racism and injustice comes from a person. So I think just to answer the question is until that racism or the discrimination is going to come from the police and the systems that are using this technology, and the idea that data can fix that rather than until we eliminate the racism and dumping and violence of policing, surveillance and technology aren't going to fix that.
Thank you. Eric?
Sure. So a couple of things. First and foremost, I'm always amazed how mean I look on camera. It's not nothing I can do about it.
Not at all. Not at all. You're great.
So Shakir and Chris covered, I think, quite well one of the obvious parts of all this, and that is that any surveillance system is part and parcel, if not when it's created, inevitably of our criminal justice system, which means all the inherent biases, all the problems that already exist are only going to be amplified. So I don't want to belabor that point, but there are two other things I'd sort of like to point out, and they track nicely with the dual roles I play. So one, I work with, I'm on the lawyers committee for the Michigan ACLU. And from the perspective of the ACLU, right, from a civil liberties perspective, one of the problems with surveillance is not only that it inevitably targets people of color, but that it is inevitably used against those who are trying to reform the system, right? So, and so it's surprising that we have such a prominent surveillance program in Detroit, in the city that is known for Black activism. It's known for having a large Muslim and immigrant community. It's known for having a very active labor movement, and these will inevitably be the targets of modern surveillance, just as they have always been the target of police surveillance. And so what you get is a compounding of the problem that you have when the system is preventing the kind of change that is necessary, whether we're talking about religious rights or the rights related to the labor movement or anything else. So one of the huge problems that we see is those people being targeted just because those are the folks that always get targeted. And they get targeted because it is minorities, people of color, religious minorities, who are the ones who are going to have the most at stake when it comes to challenging the system. So that's part of why that happens. The other thing, the other sort of harm inflicted on communities of color from surveillance is simply this: it ain't free, right? I mean, every penny spent on surveillance, right, allegedly for the purpose of creating safety, is a penny that was not spent on supporting the homeless. It was a penny that was not spent on mental health or, substance abuse, or not on education, right? And so the people who are most in need of those services are the people who are most impacted by taking money that could be spent on that right? On those very important social programs, but they lead directly to public safety, more directly than the police do, right? So this feeds into the whole defund the police, which I prefer to think of it as, sort of refunding real public safety measures, right? So inevitably, people of color are more harmed by these expensive surveillance programs than any other community. And until, I always ask people to do this one thought experiment. You can close your eyes and picture the place that you think of as the safest. And it can be a real place, it can be an imaginary place, it can be a big city, it can be a small village. But when you close your eyes and picture that, I guarantee you the one thing you will not see will be surveillance cameras, police cars. It will not be surplus military equipment. It will not be ShotSpotter. Those are the things you will not see. And that is because those very expensive things are a response to perceived danger rather than actually being elements of public safety. And if that's what we're talking about, right? The people who are deprived of that are the people who are hurt most by these expensive surveillance programs.
Thank you for that. Harvey, you get to finish us off with the introduction.
Yes, I just want to add briefly about Eric's comment about ShotSpotters and how expensive they are. Unfortunately, ShotSpotters are used in approximately 90 cities across the country. They're very expensive. They're very ineffective as well. And recent studies looking at Chicago have discussed how the MacArthur Justice Center at Northwestern, along with the Office of Independent Counsel in Chicago, have released reports last year that gave a scathing conclusion about ShotSpotters, explaining how they're ineffective, and only approximately in the single digits, 8 or 9% of those calls where the police are sent to Latinx and Black communities where they actually found that a crime had committed or a gun was actually used, whereas approximately 86 to 89% of the calls that have gone there, that have sent police there, had nothing to do with a crime or guns, and not even an investigation was a result. Yet many cities swear by these ShotSpotter systems, saying that they cut down on crime, they catch assailants who are using guns, but that's not exactly true when you look at the statistics, as I had mentioned in those two reports. Another thing that, another aspect of ShotSpotter that isn't really discussed about, which I write about in a forthcoming article with the journal, is that the ShotSpotter call that sends an officer into a neighborhood actually allows an opportunity for police officers to find reasonable suspicion as to what is going on in that community. Once they show up, once they get a ShotSpotter alert, either on their phone or from the call center that routes all these calls, they're going to go into a neighborhood, and oftentimes they'll find a young man who's just walking down the street, and the officers will claim that he had a bulge in his jacket or in his pocket, or they'll make some excuse and they'll question the individual and generally harass them until they find something to charge a crime against them for. It could be gun possession, it could be possession of marijuana. And I think ShotSpotter just give the police way too many opportunities to go into these neighborhoods to do that. And these ShotSpotters are, like I mentioned earlier, are placed in minority communities. They're not placed in other neighborhoods. And the rationale for the police departments who decide where to place those detection sensors are that those are the areas where the crimes occur, and we need to reinforce our efforts and focus even more in those areas. But from my perspective, it's circular reasoning, and it leads to racial profiling upon racial profiling, and it just is never going to end. And I think there's some hope now because people are reading more about these surveillance tools. Community groups are speaking up and actually doing something about it. That's all I have right now. Thank you.
Great. That's tons to get us started. So a lot of things there, but I think I want to just start off by picking up on something Shakir said, right? So you opened this up with a discussion about how ideologies are used to justify surveillance, and I wonder if we could get you to say a little bit more about that, particularly in the context in which you discussed where the ideologies were used, and the administration of the administration of criminal justice wasn't directed at everyone in a neutral format, but it was directed at you had Muslim and migrant populations, and of course Harvey built on that and said, like, look, the paradoxical thing about this is that the people that are trying to reform the system are the targets. So I want to just like open up like and ask, like, why is this happening? Like, what are these ideologies that are justifying it? That you sort of skated past it, Shakir, but I wonder if you could put on the table for us, like, what are the ideologies that are even justifying this in the first place?
Yeah, thanks. So I mean, I think the first one is what Eric really just covered. It's just the notion that policing is actually a source of safety, and that policing has ever been an institution that's the purpose of. I mean, we know from history that policing originates in enforcement of enslavement and enforcement of settler colonialism, of conquest, of enforcement of apartheid, and that policing has always been an instrument of racial domination. It's always been, you know, whatever you want to call it, biased, discriminatory, anything. And that it's always been, as Eric was describing, used to target people who are resisting, people who are organizing for change. Those are the things it's always done. And from that perspective, it's almost kind of utopian to think that it's going to be something else. And so, you know, from that perspective, it's hard to see equating policing like that equating of policing with safety is itself kind of, you know, something that's just not true. And we're beginning to see both on the way that Eric was talking about of the harm that causes communities, both directly as well as by, you know, sapping resources that could be used for all the things that actually keep us safe: housing, healthcare, mental health services, all of that. So that's one thing. But then also just throughout history is watching how the system has expanded, how it's taken on new resources, new powers. I think it's through that sort of demonization of different communities over time. You know, after in the post 9/11 era, all of this investment of data technologies and surveillance technologies come from this the fear mongering around Muslim communities, like migrant communities. You know, before that, obviously, demonization of the super predator, of gang youth, of other, you know, other migrant communities, and so it's over that time, it's this exploitation of kind of this sense of a other, and the kind of demonization of that to keep expanding a system that's, I think, always been responsible for maintaining white supremacy, for maintaining patriarchy, for maintaining kind of conquest and settler colonialism. And so, yeah, so that's, I mean, I think the place to really see that is just the history of what policing has always done.
That was helpful. Eric, did you want to add anything to that?
I think, I mean, one, I would I would agree with everything he says. If you look at, you know, everything from, you know, the Ghetto Informant Program, COINTELPRO, the surveillance of Muslims in the aftermath of 9/11, surveillance of essentially every single labor union leader we've ever had in this country. That is sort of the natural order of things. And it's because surveillance systems are infrastructure, right? And if you build it, it will be used, and then it must be maintained. And it's very hard to get rid of, right? So what you have is just sort of things just go along. Once you put it in place, it just it's almost impossible to rip out, because you have to rip it out from the root, and it just becomes part of the normal course of how law enforcement in particular deals with communities. And if we were to radically change the way the way law enforcement, the way society in general views, the homeless, the poor, people of color, religious minorities, then maybe it wouldn't be a problem. But when you're talking about having an algorithm for surveillance written by someone who grew up in America, you're pretty much, if you have and I've seen this in downtown Detroit, a room full of white 20-somethings looking at 30, 40 monitors up on the screen and trying to decide what looks out of place, that should be frightening. And for the record, that actually wasn't a government facility. That was a private company, Quicken Loans, that was doing that in downtown Detroit, which should freak people out just as much as having Detroit Police Department do it. So like I said, it's part and parcel of everything else that's happening in our culture. And that's what's going to be driving it, directing how this plays out.
Okay, great. Yeah, so that's really helpful for thinking about this stuff. And Chris, I'll come back to you on this one, because what Shakir and Eric just laid out was sort of based on this idea of policing as a source of public safety, and why, because we live in a racist society, the views that people possess is just going to play themselves out in surveillance technology. But in your opening remarks, Chris, you said that all surveillance tech is police tech, right? I mean, you said various things, but one of the things that stood out was all surveillance tech is police tech. And I want to give you a chance to say a little bit more about that, because people say, okay, I get all the problems that's happening in Detroit, where they're putting these green light flashing and monitoring gas stations, but what's wrong with, like, an individual's gonna say, what's wrong with my ring alarm? Like, what's really wrong with my ring alarm? And I mean, of course, a lot here plays on how you define surveillance. Is it like, are you really including in that definition any monitoring tool? Like is there something wrong with my a baby monitor in my house? But when you say that, I want to give you a chance to sort of just give us a little bit more on what you mean when you say that all surveillance tech is police tech. If I could ask you that.
Yeah, I'll do my best to answer, but first I just want to add a tiny bit to what Shakir and Eric said, in that, I look at the hype cycle of these tech companies a lot, right? And you'll see that a lot of them talk about, eliminating crime and things like that, and that what they're usually talking about, and I think this builds really on what the two folks just said, is their definition of crime. Like, they're not talking about wage theft. They're not talking about military contracts. They're not talking about white collar crime. They're not talking about the way civil forfeiture is used. So like it's a particular way in which crime is thought about, that these technologies are never going to be trained on or used for. And I think that's important. But to your other question, so the short answer is yes, right? Baby monitors, your phone, facial recognition on your phone, automated license plate, like all of it without qualification is police tech and carceral in nature, because at some point, either those technologies. So one of the things I think is that certain kinds of surveillance habituate us into thinking about surveillance as producing safety, right? So that the idea that a camera produces safety, I think in itself, although a faulty assertion, right? Like, people believe it. And so when you have something like cameras in your home, right? Like looking at what your kids are doing in their room, right? Or apps on your phone that follow your kids around, or your spouse, right? Or trackers that you put on certain things, right? Like, all of these things sort of habituate us to a belief, towards a belief that surveillance produces safety, even though it does not. But the second part of that is that any way, any surveillance tech that exists, eventually law enforcement has access to that and is going to use it in the ways that Shakir and Eric just laid out. Okay, and that's either it's going to be sold to them, they can buy it, right? So like in cases where in the limited number of cases where it might not be legal for them to, like, say, put a certain kind of tracker on your car or something like that, they could just go buy that information from certain companies. And so, you know, specifically to Ring, again, what it does, I mean, a lot of people aren't familiar with the whole program of how Ring got such a foothold in communities across the country, which is that Amazon went to police departments and essentially sort of deputizes them to become doorbell salespeople, right? Giving away free doorbells to police, having kind of sort of metrics for giving them more if they sold more, providing a portal for police to directly request footage, you know, even in sometimes writing ad copy for how police would interact with citizens in terms of like promoting the doorbell itself. I could go on, but that's, again, like that's the briefest answer I can give on that.
Thanks for that. Yeah, that's really, really helpful. So I want to pick up on that a bit and just sort of bring Harvey into the discussion and ask you something, both as you know, through your sort of professional role as an attorney in the San Jose City's Attorney's Office, but also like some of these things that you wrote about a lot of this stuff. So I want to just like just ask, like, who are supporting these technologies, right? Because it's not just happening from the police, but they often get a good amount of public support, right? So citizens, including citizens who live in these high crime neighborhoods, citizens or owners of these gas stations that think like, okay, there's just too much crime happening here, and if we could reduce it, and I can help the police in actually stopping the perpetrators, then what's wrong with that? So I wonder, Harvey, if you could just like give us a brief understanding of like who are supporting these technologies aside from the police officers or even the government in general.
Based on what I've read and what I've researched about this issue, those who support these types of technologies are in the minority compared to most of the people who are very much concerned with the privacy aspects of it and who don't want their privacy infringed at all. But I would say there are those, for example, body-worn cameras. That's a very controversial tool. Some people claim that the body-worn camera is great. When there's a confrontation with the police, we'll know exactly what had happened, whereas people on the other side of the issue claim that, well, the body-worn camera can be turned on and off at the officer's whim, and we don't get a complete picture of what exactly had gone on. But I would say beyond the corporations and those who are manufacturing these products and police departments who are in favor of them, I think there is a contingent of individuals who, like I had mentioned earlier, business owners who do want those protections or who do live in these, in quotation marks, high crime areas that do want policing, that they do exist and they are there, but they are less vocal and they are dwarfed by the great more number of people who are against surveillance technologies. And I don't have a concrete direct answer to your question, but that's what I've seen, and perhaps some of the other panelists can chime in on that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think part of that, Harvey, was me sort of presenting the question broadly and abstract. So maybe it'll help to just give a particular example. And I'll try to bring Eric into this question. So Eric, could you just say a bit about the support? Because I know Project Greenlight in particular, which you've been an opponent of, has a good amount of support, it seems, from the the gas stations are agreeing to participate in this program, and the consequences, at least when you look at some of the data, people point out and say, well, it seems to work. Like the crime is being reduced. You know, sometimes it's 25%, sometimes as high as 50%. But people seem to think that this program actually works. Like, what's wrong with that?
Breath. So let me state this for the record as clearly as possible. There is no evidence, period, that Project Greenlight cameras have at all led to a reduction in crime, period, exclamation point, end of discussion, okay? If you think otherwise, it is probably because you have had our mayor and our chief of police lie to you. That is literally the best explanation I can give you. It took them 4 years to do a study. If you read the study, and it's from Michigan State, I obviously have my thoughts about Michigan State. I will go there, right? But the study is itself laughable, right? But even this study concludes that there's no evidence independently that the cameras have had any impact on crime, right? It's a joke. Now, why people have continued to participate in this? Let's see. Maybe it's because the police come to you and say, you know, if you join this program, you get extra police officers coming around your store. Because this is the thing you have to remember about Project Greenlight. Project Greenlight contains a number of components, including prioritization when it comes to an emergency call, and sort of a dedicated police officer basically to patrol, like comes out and meets you, and et cetera, et cetera. I have spoken to store owners who have said they are afraid not to participate once they've kind of been asked to, because they're afraid the police suddenly won't come out, right? And please read the Project Greenlight partnership agreement. I'm sorry, I'm getting hyped, but this has been driving me crazy for the last 5 years. The partnership agreement says that DPD has no obligation to ever monitor the cameras live, and only an obligation to make best efforts to do so in the event of an actual 911 call coming into the police station. So really, what good is it doing? What you have is the police streaming video, you're paying to store it, the police can access it. Listen, most of these locations were required to have surveillance cameras with tape anyway. If the police wanted to make sure it was higher definition or whatever, we could just simply have passed an ordinance that would have mandated that. The police have always had the ability to get tape, right? All that's different now is when they choose to, they can view it, right? Don't listen to these ridiculous, I'm sorry, just literally the reason you hear this, the reason people think Project Greenlight works is because our former chief of police lied repeatedly to the public. The only reason they think it worked is because our mayor lies repeatedly when asked about this. There's no other way to say it. Now, there are some people who think, well, you need to keep an eye on everybody. Yeah, well, okay, fine. There's nothing you can do with people who have that attitude. Project Greenlight does not work. People think it does because our elected officials and law enforcement lied to them. What else can I say?
Hey, Daniel, I was born and raised in Detroit. I live in Dearborn now. I just want to say thank you, Eric, for saying that. And yeah, like I'm not allowed a reaction on Zoom, but you know, high five, snaps, you know, whatever. Thank you.
Native Detroiter. My father is a retired police officer. My son is currently a police officer. My stepmother was a judge. I don't have anything against law enforcement. But I have a problem against elected officials lying to us.
Thank you for that passionate response. I think like, there's tons of things to sort of dive deeply into. I mean, whether it was a lie, I mean, so one of the things that is interesting about this is that there were several reform programs going on at once, right? So people point out that, you know, Operation Ceasefire or Project Safe Neighborhoods were also simultaneous programs that were happening along with Project Green Light. So whenever there's so whenever someone says, look, there was a reduction in crime, and they say, well, how do you really know it was that as opposed to all other programs? And I think like a lot of the times people that I've heard speak in public about these things don't really draw out the nuances of like, which is hard to also tackle from a data point. And I think the sort of Michigan State survey that you mentioned sort of notes that, right? It's like, look, there's all sort of programs happening. How do we know that this is the successful one? But yeah, that's a good reason to refute the notion that this is just a successful program and we should keep it going and pour more money into it. But there was also something that that sort of your comments spark, and I want to sort of ask this question to the group again. Like, so what exactly is what are the biggest obstacles to ending targeted surveillance, right? Eric said this in various ways now at this point, that is, and I don't know if I'm putting words in your mouth, but from one perspective, it seems to be Eric pushing the point that, look, it's not the surveillance per se, but it's the people. Anytime you put a sophisticated tool in the hands of racist people, which is the consequences of living in a particular society, then you'll get a racist tool. But I don't know. Is that right? Like, is that what is that? Does everyone think that's what's going on? Because there it starts to sound like these tools are actually neutral tools, and there's nothing wrong with surveillance per se, but it's wrong with it being in the hands of the police. Say it's wrong with it being in the hands of anyone that already have certain biases against them, which is a good portion of society. So I just want to both ask, like in general, what are the biggest obstacles to ending targeted surveillance, and just tack that onto the question of like is the answer us? Like, is the answer people? Like, are we the biggest obstacle, or is there something else? And Shakir, I could bring you back in here, but the also Chris, Harvey, and Eric, I'll ask the question broadly, but Shakir, you want to lead us off?
Sure. Yeah, I think, I mean, just the biggest obstacle is, again, just this idea that what communities need that is more policing, and that surveillance is an answer. And I think the way that's just played out through history is that, communities that face poverty, that have been exploited and dominated over time, they're asking for lots of different things. But the only request that ever gets answered, or the request that everything gets kind of funneled into, is more policing and more surveillance. And so, and that, I'm glad Eric framed that in terms of, what, like, thinking about Project Greenlight and what people are actually asking for. But we also have to, in addition to that, there's also kind of a broader ecosystem that, especially with the surveillance tech, that I think of as a kind of obstacle to ending these systems. And the way this question is framed around reform is, a lot of that obstacle is this idea that we can reform the surveillance, that we can make it, we can kind of tinker with it and make it more accurate. We can reduce the bias. We can make it more transparent or something like that. When everything we've been talking about today is about, how the fundamental premise of policing, how the history of policing means that these technologies are never going to be able to use in a way that isn't just serving, put aside bias or prejudice, that isn't just serving domination, that isn't just serving kind of the ideologies that are behind policing. And when we look at what those institutions are, yeah, there's, sometimes this gets caught in this debate of, okay, like what do over-police communities actually want? And that, maybe they do want some, they do want things that keep them safer, and that whole debate. We also have to look at that this notion that of kind of reform is often being pushed by an ecosystem of academics, of nonprofit organizations, of the industry itself. I really appreciate everything Harvey was saying about ShotSpotter, and what we're beginning to now see about how both how bogus it is in its operation, plus how it just directly primes police to go into areas ready to shoot and looking out for a gun, or just having basis to stop people. well, at the same time that we know that's true, ShotSpotter is also, the company is literally funding academic studies to kind of, put out, to cook up the data to show that no, it's actually, reducing, that's serving their ends. And literally like they have on their payroll academics, they're funding kind of think tanks. Like one example is a nonprofit based at NYU called the Policing Project, that's funded by a lot of these, a lot of surveillance companies. ShotSpotter is one, Axon, Amazon Web Services. And so that ecosystem that either, you could, the really cynical way to look at it is that they're literally just kind of instruments of this industry. Another way to look at it is that they're committed to that idea. They're not questioning that basic, premise of is more investment in policing actually helping keep communities safer. And so, either way, and so, yeah, as part of the fight to end these systems, I think we also need to be organizing against and confronting that entire ecosystem, not just the tech alone, but everything that surrounds it.
Harvey, I want to ask you if you have anything to add to that, particularly in the context of, and this comes from one of the Q&As, one of the questions raised by the audience. So particularly in the context of the position that all tech is bad, right? So sometimes we hear the view that all tech is bad, and we think like, okay, is there no middle ground? Like it really is the, sort of, either we have the technology that's in place and the police have their hands on these fancy tools and they're going to use them in whatever way that they choose, or where, Shakir seems to lean towards, again, I don't want to put any words in his mouth, but Shakir seems to lean towards like, look, maybe we shouldn't reform this. Maybe, maybe abolition of these sort of surveillance technology is really what we should be leaning towards or striving for. Like, is there a middle ground, Harvey? Like, is there a reasonable way to use this sort of technology that doesn't collapse into the worrisome surveillance state that we see, and the problems that was sort of drawn out by Shakir just now, and even Eric laid out so eloquently earlier? Like, is there a middle ground?
I'm not sure if there's a middle ground or not, but I think through more transparency, with the public knowing about these tools and what they can do, hopefully that would bring attention to city councils, city governments, state governments, and just to have those who can do something about these issues be aware of them and do a fine balancing. And I think that is the way forward. And some cities like San Francisco have been very preemptive. They've passed legislation that govern facial recognition before racial recognition had even become a thing here. But going back to what Shakir had mentioned about those who are too quick to attribute the successes of reducing crime to the use of technology, I would like to take a specific example. Oakland, California, in the year, let's say 2015 through 2019, the city had used ShotSpotter extensively. It was in play, and there was a reduction in the number of shootings, but it wasn't because of the faulty technology of ShotSpotter. ShotSpotter had nothing to do with it. It was because the local citizens and the police and other community stakeholders applied a ceasefire strategy. And what they did was they focused on, say, 100 people who are most likely to be involved in shootings, and along with community activists, church pastors, family members, they were able to organize group meetings and to hold these individuals accountable and to really focus a lot of attention on them. And that attributed to the reduction in the number of shootings. The shootings fell from 557 in 2012 to 284 in 2019. And some other cities have also applied a ceasefire strategy that has worked. And all these plans are different. And of course, you can't really compare all the various programs across the country, but Oakland has been a model that other cities have emulated, and that's my 2 cents on that issue.
Thank you for that. That was very helpful. So we also have another question, which generally is asking about accountability, right? And in a nutshell, asking like, putting forward that we live in a system of check and balances, and if we have this big, powerful organization of police, then who are going to police the police, so to speak, right? In particular, the question is raised asking about Detroit and the Detroit Board of Police Commissioners, which the questioner thinks is not really effective. So the nutshell of the question, I now ask, I'll come to you, Eric, and Chris, you could also jump in as a native Detroiter, because the question is very Detroit specific, but the question is just asking about this sort of board of accountability, and asking how common it is this body across America, whether these sort of bodies are effective, and more generally, what are effective ways for citizens to keep the police in check? So I'll ask Eric to just start us off, and maybe Chris, if you could jump in and say anything about the Detroit Board of Police Commissioners in particular, but of course, Shakir and Harvey, the end part of the question about what effective ways are citizens to keep police in check doesn't require any knowledge about this particular board. So if you wanted to weigh in on that, we would certainly welcome your answers. Harvey?
So as
Eric?
So as an initial matter, I'm not familiar with the most recent, we recently had elections. I really haven't had a chance to see this current iteration of the Board of Police Commissioners in action. The prior version was a bit of a joke, really, to be perfectly honest. Whenever someone came in to complain about the police, I've seen them roll their eyes and do like this. It's like, oh, go away. So as an oversight body, they were an utter failure, right? And in fact, when it came to surveillance, it was only massive public pressure that got them to pump the brakes a little bit. And even then, all they did was have offered the police a chance to explain, but they never allowed any of the opponents of facial recognition to come in and explain their position. So that is what they are supposed to do. They are limited, as most police oversight bodies are, by the fact that they have so many former police officers on it, and the people who tend to get elected are people who are basically police sycophants, right? So that's one problem. The other problem is that the laws regarding the use of technology, right? So if the Board of Police Commissioners isn't going to provide oversight, you'd like to think the courts would. Unfortunately, technology gets way ahead of the law, right, in many respects. So what constitutes a search? What constitutes, a reasonable expectation of privacy? All these principles were developed with technology that, was not remotely comparable to what we have now. So until we get case law that begins to define what parameters are, for example, do we have a right to an expectation of anonymity, right? Is that a reasonable expectation? Until we begin to develop the laws in this kind of way, it's going to be very, very difficult to actually have anything counterbalance in the police.
Yeah, just to add to that, Daniel, and to in some ways also address the previous question. I'm not of the mind that all tech is bad, but and I want to make sure that I'm not forced into that extreme corner. But in a lot of cases, in fact, in most cases, what is happening is not that either police departments or technologists or tech companies, they're not coming to communities and asking us what we need. These technologies are developed by and large by people who have no understanding of what communities want or need, and have a very limited view of what crime is or what safety is, what policing is. I think about Baltimore, where a Texas billionaire funded a plane to fly over the city, to record the movements of people, primarily communities of color. And so, that Texas billionaire didn't come to the people of Baltimore and ask them what they needed. And so the other thing is I think there's a sort of misuse of these questions about transparency and accountability, because in a lot of cases, what that comes to mean is we're going to tell you the fucked up things that we're doing, And in some cases, they're not even going to do that. They're going to redact a lot of it, right? Because they'll say that, you know, if we give it away, then that gives criminals an edge and things like that. And so what those things, this is not what those things are supposed to mean in an ideal fashion, right? Is that there would be input and governance in a way that it wasn't just, oh, we're going to tell you the fucked up things we're doing, right? But that's not what these things have come to mean. And so when we use them, you know, so again, to go back to my Ring doorbell example, right? So police can make all kinds of backdoor agreements with tech companies, and don't have to say to you like, oh, Amazon came to us and said this. So certain places, say like in Boston, have passed legislation that says like if police want to have any kind of agreement with a technology company or want to like introduce a new technology, there's like a set of steps that they have to go through. I think Detroit has a limited version of this. Eric can speak to that much better than I can, but I think it's a very limited version. And so I do think that, yeah, there's a greater need to like really investigate, like interrogate the way that we think about these terms, because they've taken on a meaning that I don't think kind of like in an ideal way of governance that they're ever meant to mean.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that. Yeah, that was very helpful. And I mean, unfortunately, we're just coming on to the end of the hour. So, but I want to give our panelists the final word to say something. So, inspired partly by Chris's comment that not all tech is bad, I just want to ask the panelists, give the panelists 1 minute each. So we're right there, got enough for everyone to speak for 1 minute. Give each of the panelists 1 minute opportunity to just give some closing remarks. And in your remarks, I'm going to challenge you to say one good thing about technology. And since Chris, you just inspired the question, I'm gonna start off with you, and then go on to Shakir, Harvey, and Eric.
Yeah, I mean, disclaimer is that I do spend most of my time saying all the things that are bad about this stuff. But I mean, the obvious thing to me is that it's enabled us to have this conversation and be relatively safe. And so, yeah, I just appreciate everyone's time. The people on here whose work I'm familiar with, Eric, Shakir, I'm big fans. And Harvey, it's nice to meet you. So that this is what I appreciate. And that's a good thing. And I won't get into all the negative externalities of Zoom right now. But yeah, that's it.
Great. Shakir, final remarks, and what is one thing good about technology?
Yeah, I guess there's kind of two ways I can answer. One is, well, first of all, it's funny, often I and stuff of peace planning were accused of kind of literally being Luddites or neo-Luddites. And I think, to some extent that's true. And even the history of like the term Luddite, I think Luddites were a movement of recognizing that technology was being controlled mainly by, the capitalist class, and it was trying to restore the means of production. So in that way, yeah, you can think of if technology is really directed by and in the hands of working people, of colonized people, then maybe there's some value there. And then also just as surveillance isn't only digital technology, I think also we can think of technology isn't just digital technology. The ways that our communities have always gotten to know each other, helped each other, protected each other, kept safe, those are technologies too. And that's kind of knowledge and wisdom that we should be celebrating.
Great. Harvey?
In closing, I would just echo what Eric said about the case law slowly developing. It's going to take forever. And by the time there's a Supreme Court decision on that particular tool, it's already passé. We're no longer going to use it. So I think if we're going to push back against surveillance technology, it's going to have to be done at the community and legislative levels, to be loud and to voice opposition. And we've seen this in Stingray cell site simulator legislation that was passed due to the outcry against their use. A couple of good things about technology that I do like is the ability to to catch an Uber ride and to know exactly when the ride is coming. And I also like to track my packages when I order things, and I'll close with that. Thank you.
Perfect. Eric, you have the final word. We're right at the hour.
I have the compendium of human knowledge right here in my hand, and it's a good way to watch cat videos.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you to our distinguished panelists. We can't see you clap, so I'll just clap. I'll applaud for everyone here on behalf of the journal as well as the institution. We really appreciate you for taking the time and participating in this great discussion. And thanks everyone for joining us, and see you soon.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Love, peace, and hair grease.